I'm going to try and set out basically what I think we need to do to have a methodology, a Marxist methodology for understanding pre-capitalist society. And I'm not just talking actually about the ancient Greek world. I tried to get them to change the title to the ancient world generally, and they forgot. But in actual fact, I want to talk not just about the ancient world generally, but about pre-capitalist society and how Marxists should approach pre-capitalist society in general. But I'm going to focus mainly, in terms of examples, on the ancient Greek world. Now, this is going to be quite controversial. A review of my book on Rome has just appeared in the ISJ. Some of you may have read it already. I've certainly read it twice. I recommend it to you for those who want to be aware that this is really a very controversial discussion that we're having. In fact, Steve Roskams, who wrote the review, is an old friend, and we go back a long way, and we've been having this argument for a long time, and I think the content of his review, from my point of view, was fairly predictable. He accuses me of not really being a Marxist at all, and not really having a Marxist approach to the understanding of the ancient world. Now, what I'm actually going to try and do is stand on the shoulders of three giants. One of them is Vere Gordon Childe, who was probably the greatest archaeologist of the 20th century. One of them is G.E.M. de ste Croix. I don't actually know if that's how he pronounced his name because I never met him, but I do know that he used to quip that he was called Croix. So I'm just going to call him Croix. And in fact, that means that my three giants, because the third of them is Tony Cliff, they alliterate beautifully. We're talking about Childe, Croix, and Cliff this morning, comrades. I'm talking about Croix, who is a great ancient historian who attempts to apply a Marxist method to the understanding particularly of the ancient Greek world. But I'm also going to be talking a bit about Tony Cliff. Now, if you stand on the shoulders of three giants, the metaphor breaks down, of course, because you fall off, and it's going to be for comrades to judge whether or not that's actually what I do in the next 30 minutes or so. Steve Roskam certainly thinks I've fallen off. But I am going to draw on three different traditions to try and build what I think is the kind of approach we need to the understanding of pre-capitalist society. Now, let me just say a little bit of biographical stuff really about these three people, or how these three people contribute to my understanding. Childe, first of all, was a middle-class Australian who proved to be a brilliant scholar and became radicalised at Oxford and then back in Australia at the time of the First World War and after the First World War. And in fact, his first adult job, if you like, or adult role, was being actively involved in Australian Labour politics in that great epoch of war and revolution between 1914 and 1923. And Childe was radicalised permanently by the experiences which he had then. And let me say that the first book that he wrote, interestingly, was an absolutely outstanding analysis of the trade union and labour bureaucracy, and an absolutely pioneering work at the time when it came out. Then when the downturn came in 1922, he made the decision to become an academic, and from then on until his death in 1957, that is what he was, holding two main academic posts, an archaeology professorship in Edinburgh and then an archaeology professorship in London. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say in relation to Childe that he was the greatest archaeologist of the 20th century, heavily influenced by Marxist ideas, determined to develop a materialist approach. And I can't begin to do justice to him in this talk. There's an article in the ISJ where I attempt to summarise what I think Childe contributed and what the limitations are. There's one idea that I'm particularly going to draw on from Childe in this meeting, and that is the idea of progressive social evolution. That's the big Childean idea that is part of the approach that I want to advocate, the idea of progressive social evolution. An odd thing about Childe is that he really doesn't talk about the class struggle at all. Very often he doesn't even talk about classes. Certainly doesn't talk about the class struggle, and he doesn't seem to see the class struggle as a major moving force in history, which is why Childe is not enough. And I look to Croix, this great ancient historian, trying to apply a Marxist method to the understanding of ancient Greek history in Oxford from 1953 onwards, when he was appointed to a post at Oxford. I really look to him for this idea that if you want to understand what moves the ancient world, how the ancient world is shaped and changed and transformed and so on, you have to have an understanding, not just of class and class relations, but of active class struggle as a formative part of history, as central to the historical process. Croix's great work, of course, was the class struggle in the ancient Greek world. There are copies here. This great, fat, learned, scholarly tome, which is actually one of the masterpieces, I think, of historical writing, Marxist historical writing in the last, two generations. Then there's Cliff. I want to say something about Tony Cliff, because I think there's something missing in Croix as well. Just as Childe doesn't really have the class struggle at the centre of his understanding of how the ancient world develops, I think there's a problem, there's a limitation, a grave limitation on Croix's understanding. And it is, let me put it like this, I think it's that the class struggle is not contextualised as taking place within a global system which has its dynamic, and within which class relations form and class struggles take place. Now, with me, and I'm talking about, there's a bit of sort of personal history here, but when the penny dropped through reading essentially and listening sometimes to Tony Cliff, when the penny dropped that the Soviet Union and the other so-called communist states or worker states had to be capitalist because they operated within a global capitalist system and therefore had to conform to the logic of the global system. When that penny dropped, it was an extraordinary moment for me, and it was the basis of my long-standing commitment to the tradition of the Socialist Workers' Party. That idea, I now want to try and apply to our understanding of pre-capitalist society. You can't understand class relations and class struggles unless you have a theory of the global system and the dynamic of the global system within which those class relations take place, in exactly the same way as we have traditionally argued. You can't interpret what is happening in one particular state and how class relations develop in one particular state in the modern world without having a global picture, without having a sense of capitalism as a whole. Now, so from Cliff, if you like, I draw this idea that we have to have as our starting point the global system. The problem is, I don't think Marxists have really got to grips with understanding what the dynamic of the ancient and indeed the medieval world is. And I want to suggest to you that it's the ancient world and the medieval world are driven by competitive military accumulation. Now that's a key idea, which I think is the framing for our understanding of class relations and social development in pre-capitalist society. A fundamental difference between capitalism and pre-capitalist society is that technique is essentially stagnant. In terms of lifespans, in terms of many lifespans very often, technique is essentially stagnant. The capitalist world is characterized by the constant revolutionizing of the means of production as capitalists compete with each other. That does not happen in the ancient and the medieval world, and the difference is the importance of that difference can't be exaggerated. Water mills, let me give you one or two examples. Water mills lasted for hundreds of years. If you were a medieval peasant born into a village in England in the 13th century, there'd be water mills when you started, and they'd still be grinding flour using water mills at the end. Technique is effectively stagnant. Wooden ploughs lasted for thousands of years. Hand axes lasted for millions of years, when technologically nothing happened. It's my only prop. This is the cutting edge of human technology for millions of years. Should we pass it round? Now, of course, Marx understood this. I'm going to read that famous passage where he talks about the difference between capitalism and pre-capitalist society. This is the Communist Manifesto. He says, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence of all earlier industrial classes. So it's clear, there's a fundamental difference in character when we compare capitalist and pre-capitalist societies. For the rich to get rich in the ancient world, or richer in the ancient world, there has to be another mechanism for accumulating surplus, because they can't do it by investing in new techniques, because the new techniques aren't there. The easiest way to get rich, or richer, if you're already rich and powerful in the ancient world, is to build armies and fight wars. And the logic is really very, very simple. As you get the development of armed force, the more aggressive ruling classes creating effective means of both defending their own land and labour and territory and resources, but also plundering those of others. Everybody is locked into a system where everybody has to plough resources into creating armies, into creating armaments, into creating the mechanism for defending themselves, which can then be used by the more successful ruling classes to attack other ruling classes and to accumulate surplus through the use of warfare, with the result being that small states get gobbled up by the bigger states. Because the ancient and the medieval world is divided into different polities, because it's divided into separate tribes, separate city-states, separate kingdoms, separate empires, it is locked into a permanent process of military competition, and because military competition is the only effective way, or military success is the only effective way in which you can rapidly increase the surplus controlled by one ruling class as opposed to another, that becomes the central mechanism by which accumulation takes place. Let me give you one or two examples. When Alexander the Great captured the Persian capital Persepolis in 331 BC, the sources tell us the treasure seized was worth, a great store of bullion, was worth 300 times the annual income of the richest city in ancient Greece. War was very, very profitable for the most successful ruling classes in antiquity. When Pompey the great Roman general, in the middle of the 1st century BC, when he conquered Anatolia and Syria, Anatolia, modern Turkey, and Syria, the tax revenues, the tax income of the Roman state was increased by 70% as a result of those conquests and that addition of territory, tax-bearing territory. When the Emperor Trajan conquered Dacia, modern Romania, in AD 106, the sources tell us they took 500,000 slaves, physical seizure of 500,000 labourers being brought into the centre of the Roman imperial system to labour for the Roman ruling class. It's not an exaggeration to say that the dynamic of military competition and military accumulation is fundamental to what ruling classes are doing in a pre-industrial world. That is, in a world which predates the period where rapid development of technique makes directly economic competition dominant, as in the modern capitalist world. So that's one idea, that there is a global dynamic of competitive military accumulation, and we need to understand how class relations are developing in the ancient world in relation to that. Here's the second idea. It's the idea that then within societies there is a class struggle between those who control the state and those who control the land and the producing classes. At the same time as ruling classes are fighting each other, ruling classes of landlords, of generals, and so on, they are also screwing their own working population, slaves and serfs and tenants and wage labourers and so on. And I have to say, I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference whether people are technically slaves or technically serfs or technically tenant farmers. I just don't think it is a fundamental significance in understanding the ancient world. They are extracting surplus from the producing population, and they are doing it using military force. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. I just want to make the point that Croix is fantastic on this, in making this process central. I mean, the book is packed with these fantastic anecdotes. I'm going to quote my favourite, just because I love it so much, where the bandit, and this is a social bandit, of course, a social rebel, the bandit Buller, who's been at large in Italy for 2 or 3 years with a band of 600 followers. He's finally captured, he's betrayed and captured, and he's brought before the Roman prefect, some sneering member of the upper class. And this prefect says to him, "Why did you become a bandit?" And he stands there and he says straight back, looking him straight in the eye, "Why did you become a prefect?" Which I think is just a brilliant expression, of the class contradiction. And Croix's book is absolutely full of that kind of thing. It breathes with the spirit of the class struggle. But let me tell you this fundamental difference between the modern class struggle and the ancient class struggle, or rather the way in which surplus is extracted. The way it works under capitalism is that fraud is dominant. You enter into a contract with the boss, and that determines how much the boss is going to pay you. You have to accept the contract, otherwise you starve, you get what you get. In the pre-industrial world, the pre-capitalist world, it doesn't work like that. Because the ruling class has to come and physically take the surplus. Force is involved in the process of exploitation at an absolutely basic level. The capture of large numbers of people in war who were then turned into slaves, put to work under the lash. That's a military process. The way in which the landlord's bailiffs are sent out with a posse of thugs to collect the rent in kind at harvest time each year, that's a military operation. The way in which Roman tax collectors went out into the countryside with groups of soldiers to support them, and where it was well known that flogging was the central mechanism by which the surplus was accumulated, because the peasants would try and hide the harvest, so it wasn't clear how much there was. The process of collecting surplus, of extracting surplus, was a military operation. So that it becomes true to say that not only is it the case that you've got competition between different ruling classes, driven essentially by a military process, by the accumulation of the means of making war, you've also got the direct, frequent, repeated use of force in the extraction of surplus from their own populations. And why are they wanting to extract labour services, rents, taxes, interest payments, all the various different forms in which the surplus comes from them? Why are they wanting to do it? Because they are subject to a competitive pressure with other ruling classes who are also accumulating the means of making war. And if you're not successful in the ancient or the medieval world in accumulating the means of making war, then you will be gobbled up by another polity, by another state. Now you put those two things together, the idea of competitive military accumulation and the idea of a class struggle taking place within each polity, within each society, and I think you've got the two motors of the ancient world, or the medieval world. Let me give you a concrete example of that. I'm going to take the example of Greek democracy because Croix talks about that all the time in the book. I mean, it's the centre, really, the living heart of his book is this idea of democracy, how democracy is achieved and how it's broken down. Bitter class struggles were waged inside the Greek city-state in the 6th century BC to create democracy, and then in the 5th and the 4th centuries BC there were bitter struggles to defend it, and then a series of struggles subsequently whereby it was gradually broken up. It was a quite extraordinary moment in history and a quite extraordinary achievement of the class struggle. In ancient Athens, in the 5th century BC, it was literally the case that you had a form of popular power where there was a participatory democracy where the citizen body as a whole would come together in a mass assembly to make important decisions. There were jury courts of several hundred, made up again, of ordinary citizens, and where you had regularly elected officials. Much more democratic in terms of its basic principles than anything we have in parliamentary democracy today. Now, I know what some people are thinking. You know, there were a lot of people who didn't count in the democracy. The slaves didn't count, and there were quite a few of them, and the foreigners didn't count, and the women didn't count. So, you know, of course, it's not democracy in the sense that we understand it. What is crucial about it is that in the democratic states, the majority who shared political power were actually working farmers. That's the crucial thing. And whatever limitations it had, I don't think any of us would have had any doubt at all, had we been alive at the time, which side we were on. And you only have to read the anti-democratic literature of the ancient ruling classes to get a sense of what side you would have had to have been on in those conflicts between democrats and oligarchs. The sneering, grinding, relentless hatred of the Greek aristocracy and the Roman aristocracy of democracy makes it absolutely clear that it is something that we would have supported. And it produces astonishing cultural achievements. I mean, virtually all of the great achievements of classical civilization took place in a few decades, in the 5th century BC, mainly in Athens. The art, the drama, the philosophy, the development of science, I mean, drama, absolutely fantastic things in a very short space of time, because the democracy created a mass base for an explosion of cultural activity. In much the same way, I think, as you see that explosion of culture happening in relation to revolutionary periods in modern history. And then Croix charts the way in which it's gradually eroded. And here I want to introduce the idea that military competition is fundamental to the creation of the democracy and then to its destruction. The key thing about the democracy was that the military defence of the Greek city-state depended on the heavy infantry service of the rich peasant class and on the military service of the poor peasant class as rowers in the triremes, in the warships. In other words, military power was bound up with the involvement of ordinary citizens in the business of defending the state, and that was crucial to giving them the political weight to actually win democracy. When the Greek city-states go down to defeat by Macedonia, a kingdom that has essentially a tribal and a more or less feudal social base, and uses its wealth to create a professional army of soldiers. When the Greek city-states go down to defeat by that professional tribal and feudal army, that destroys the basis of the democracy. There's a relationship here, in other words, between military competition and the kind of army, the kind of military forces that you're creating, that you're dependent upon, and the kind of political structures that can emerge, because it affects the balance of class forces inside the polity. The Macedonian professional army is the beginning of that process, really, whereby an alliance of Greek aristocrats and Macedonian kings and Roman governors and Roman emperors gradually break up and demolish Greek democracy, which has been based on the city-state and the involvement of ordinary citizens in the defence of the state, and therefore in the political running of the state. Now, that's two ideas we've dealt with, and I'm suggesting that we need these blocks to the idea of competitive military accumulation, the idea of the class struggle shaping society. We need these to actually understand these ancient and medieval societies. But there's one more idea that, in a way, is the most important idea, because I think that this is rather new, and it comes from Childe, and it comes from taking Childe seriously. It's the idea of progressive social evolution. It's the idea of progress. There is a historical track of competitive military accumulation, and I want to suggest to you that there is another track which is actually about the accumulation of progressive knowledge and technique, and therefore an advance, a movement forwards for humanity, both processes mediated by the class struggle. This is how Gordon Childe defined progress. He described it as the accumulation of effective knowledge that makes possible better control over nature, increases in labour productivity, and an enlarged store of economic resources available for the satisfaction of human need. That seems an entirely reasonable way in which we might define progress. He argued that it is not inevitable, and I think that that is correct. We might still all be using hand axes, but for certain accidents of historical development several thousand years ago, I think progressive development is inevitable once we have capitalist takeoff, once we have industrial takeoff, but getting to that point is not an inevitable process in history. But it does happen. And of course, Childe, as a man of the Enlightenment, as Marx was, believed not only was it happening, not only had it happened, but also it was obviously something desirable, because it increased the ability of human beings to satisfy their needs. Now, in relation to progress, in the sense I've just defined it, Childe argued that most of what we see surviving archaeologically from the ancient world was not part of it. I mean, he argued that pyramids, great tombs for Egyptian kings, he argued ziggurats, these great temples built by the Mesopotamian priest kings, the wars that we know about, the empire building that went on, the amphitheatres constructed by Roman emperors and so on. He argued that all of that is actually waste expenditure by the ruling class. And to the extent that the ruling class succeeds in accumulating surplus, which it then uses to build armies, to create empires, to fight wars, to build great monuments of these kinds, to that extent surplus is being drained away from productive investment, from productive use. And that is a barrier to progress. It's one of the things that holds progress back. He also talks, incidentally, about the way in which, as a powerful ruling class, successful in accumulating surplus, emerges, they develop magic and religion as and ideology as a way of obscuring the nature of reality and holding people back as a way of shoring up their own position. He talks about the way in which magic is a way of making people believe they're going to get what they want, whereas religion is a system for persuading them that they ought to want what they get. His last book, published a year after his death, The Prehistory of European Society, is particularly interesting on this subject of progressive social evolution. I'm not necessarily going to recommend that you read it. I mean, you have to be sort of seriously into such things as Pontic ochre grave culture as against single grave battle axe culture in Bronze Age Central Europe, and interested in distinguishing different pottery styles from these different cultures and so on. There's a certain amount of heavyweight archaeology in there. Take it from me that it is a very interesting book in the conclusions that he draws, drawing from it the idea that insofar as the ruling classes in Egypt and Mesopotamia and so on, of the great civilizations, were successful in accumulating surplus, they suppressed progress. I'm going to read sort of one or two quotations out to you so you really get the flavour of what he is arguing about the nature of progressive social development. The urban revolution in Egypt and Mesopotamia had liberated craftsmen from the food quest, only to consign them to an exploited subject class. It supplied them with raw materials on which to exercise their skills, but no inducement to improve them. It guaranteed them security of employment, but no prospect of superior status. Now, his argument is the result is that technique stagnates in the great empires. because the surplus is not there at the base where the productive classes are. And he contrasts that with the way in which in Bronze Age Europe there is a leapfrogging over the old empires because of the much freer conditions in which craft workers were operating in that society. He says, and this is contemporary with the situation that he's just described in Mesopotamia and Egypt, despite all disabilities, European metal workers were free. They weren't tied to any one patron or even to a single tribal society. They were producing for an intertribal, if not an international market. And the conclusion that he draws is that there is then a rapid development of technique. Their products, tools, weapons, toilet articles underwent a rapid typological development to which the ancient East, the great civilizations, offers no parallel. And here typological development means progressive and cumulative modification in the direction of higher efficiency. He then takes flight. And I'm going to read this to you because I think it's rather nice. I don't know whether it's strictly true, but it gives you a sense of his vision of what human progress is actually all about. Right at the end of the book he says, the metics at Athens, the craft workers, the wayfaring journeymen of the Middle Ages, and the migrant craft unionists of the 19th century are the lineal descendants of the itinerant bronze workers just described. But so were the natural philosophers and the sophists in classical Greece, the travelling scholars of medieval Europe, and the natural scientists from the days of Galileo and Newton to 1945. There is this idea, in other words, that it's not just in a description of the Bronze Age world, but more generally in a description of the pre-capitalist past and perhaps right up to the present. It's this idea that progress, the development of knowledge, true knowledge, real knowledge, the development of skill and technique is something rooted in the producing classes. And insofar, the implication is, insofar as the producing classes are successful in the class struggle, in winning a larger portion of the surplus, from a ruling class committed to wasting surplus, to that extent there is actual progress, to that extent there is investment in new technique, and we see this accumulation of new technique and knowledge which is the basis for Childe progress. And here's the last point on this, before I conclude. Childe also argues that when the great civilizations go down, as they do, repeatedly through ancient and medieval history, and conventional historians and archaeologists talk about dark ages, because the tops aren't living in villas and building great monuments and can't afford mosaics anymore and so on. So you enter a kind of dark age. The Childe's argument is that in actual fact we don't see a collapse of useful knowledge and skill and technique. Because when we look at the next stage in human social development, the key advances have been retained and are then the basis on which we move forward in another period. So there is a track of progressive social evolution running through prehistory, antiquity and the medieval period into the modern era which is upwards, which is cumulative, which is not affected by the collapse of the great civilizations. And here, on this particular question, Croix agrees completely with Childe. And in Croix's great tome, I just reread this, and I was very intrigued to discover he actually quotes Childe directly on this question about the way in which the collapse, the way in which the collapse of the Roman Empire doesn't mean the collapse of production and the collapse of the knowledge that's embodied in productive techniques. So this is Croix quoting Childe. The cultural capital accumulated by the civilizations of antiquity was no more annihilated in the collapse of the Roman Empire than smaller accumulations had been in the lesser catastrophes that interrupted and terminated the Bronze Age. Of course, as then, many refinements were swept away, but for the most part, these had been designed for and enjoyed by only a small and narrow class. Most achievements that had proved themselves biologically to be progressive and had become firmly established on a genuinely popular footing by the participation of wider classes, were conserved. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, city life, with all its implications, still continued. Most crafts were still plied with all the technical skill and equipment evolved in classical and Hellenistic times. What a powerful vision that is, I think. And I'm going to suggest to you what the key ideas of this meeting, I'm just finishing, what the key ideas of the meeting might be. First of all, it's the idea that there is a store of knowledge and skill and technique which accumulates at the base of society, and the significant advances are not actually forgotten because they are embedded in a large population of producers. And the effect of that, as we move forwards through the pre-capitalist past, is that we get people working the land more effectively, raising stock more effectively, producing tools more effectively, raising the productivity of labour, and making it possible to produce more wealth to satisfy human need. That progressive social evolution is actually happening. It happens, however, jerkily and unevenly. It's going up. The general trend is up. The general trajectory is up, but it's going up and down. And central to what holds it back is the role of the ruling class. The role of the ruling class in accumulating surplus to build armies, to make empires, to wage wars, to build great monuments. Huge amounts of waste expenditure by the ruling class. Such that, to the extent that the class struggle is successful in limiting ruling class exploitation and therefore war making, to the extent that it is successful in getting a larger proportion of the surplus held within the productive classes of society, to that extent there is social progress. There are powerful lessons, comrades, in the struggles of the ancient past on which I think we can draw in the present. Later. Well, there's the usual caveat on these occasions, which is that I can't begin to deal comprehensively with everything that's been raised in the discussion. And I also always feel that on these occasions one has an unfair advantage, because I get to speak last and people can't sort of come back on the things I'm going to say. Nonetheless, I'm going to throw out one or two ideas in response to the contributions that comrades have made. Let me start with that last contribution. There's a fundamental difference between capitalist imperialism and the kind of imperialism which happens before the development of capitalism. There is a fusing of geopolitical competition between states and economic competition between blocks of capital that gives rise to capitalist imperialism. That fusing together is a reflection of the fact that economic competition drives modern capitalism, because of the way in which capitalists can accumulate surplus by investing in advances in technique and raising the productivity of labour. They're competing with each other economically, and that's why you get the fusing of economic competition with geopolitical competition. Therefore, the kind of imperialism which we're talking about in the ancient world and the medieval world is fundamentally different, in that it is essentially a mechanism for accumulating surplus through plunder, a system of what I describe in the Rome book as robbery with violence. In effect, the surpluses that have already been accumulated by some ruling classes are being physically taken by a more successful military ruling class militarily, and that's a fundamental mechanism. Now, comrades have rightly pointed out that there are a lot of societies that don't seem to be doing that very much, and the example of Egypt was quoted. That's a good example. You see, there's a sense in what's happening here is that the reason I wrote about Rome was partly because that's what I happen to know about, but also because Rome is the supreme example of this idea of competitive military accumulation. That doesn't mean that every ancient society or medieval society is equally good at it. In fact, there are all sorts of societies that don't really participate very much at all for much of the time in competitive military accumulation, because they don't need to, and they can be quite stagnant. politically and militarily and socially and so on. Egypt is a classic example. There's a period of 200 or 300 years at the beginning of Egyptian civilization where there's a whole load of advances. Agriculture, irrigation, ploughing, writing, all the great achievements of Egyptian civilization happen in the space of 2 or 3 centuries at the very beginning. And then nothing happens because they waste all the surplus on building pyramids to pharaohs that don't come back to life and building temples to gods who don't exist. There's colossal waste expenditure which actually holds the whole development of technique back, and that's crucial really to what Childe is arguing. I talk about Rome in the book, and Rome is a supreme example because Rome seems to illustrate the power of that dynamic when it takes off, and the impact it has on neighbouring societies, forcing them to militarise, forcing them to engage in military accumulation as well in order to defend themselves. And if I just pick up that question about the Roman Republic, Rome is different from the city-states of ancient Greece. Rome does have massive class struggles, internal class struggles in the 5th and the 4th century BC, and again in the 1st century BC, but it doesn't result in democracy. What's interesting, I think, about the class struggle in Rome, and let's be clear, it's the class struggle that creates the Roman imperialist dynamic. It's an outcome of the class struggle. What's interesting about it, I think, is that it ends in a class compromise. And it really is a class compromise, because there are significant constitutional and legal and political defences given to the common citizens of Rome, which limits the degree to which they can be exploited by the Roman landlord class, the Roman aristocracy. That limitation on exploitation, super-exploitation at home, means that the Roman ruling class looks outwards in order to accumulate, rather than ratcheting up the rate of exploitation at home. But it also means that those common citizens who've got those defences established through the class struggle actually have a stake in the system, and they get a share in the booty. It's a much smaller share, but they get a share. They get a share in the distribution of land, a much smaller share, but they get a share. So the rank and file of the legions, and they are for most of the Republican period, a citizen militia, for most of that time they have an interest in actually fighting alongside their ruling class leaders, their aristocratic leaders. So you actually get, through the compromise, which is a result of the class struggle, a distinctive kind of imperialist dynamic, Rome becoming this highly predatory, aggressive state, and a supreme example of what I'm describing as this dynamic of competitive military accumulation or robbery with violence put colloquially. Now, last thing I'm going to say is to come back on the distinction between the ancient world and the medieval world. I think first it has to be said I agree with what Danny said. This is a Eurocentric obsession, because we see this sharp distinction between the ancient world, a dark age of some kind, and then the medieval world. And I don't think you've got that clear linear development represented in other sequences. But I've got a more fundamental problem, and it is that I simply do not think you can explain what is happening in the ancient or the medieval world according to whether producers are slaves or serfs. I don't think there's a fundamental difference that necessarily flows from that in terms of the kind of social formation that you end up with. In actual, Croix's book is highly problematic in the way it deals with this problem, because he admits that slavery isn't dominant through most of antiquity, that actually the slaves constitute a significant proportion of the surplus producing population in Italy and Sicily, if we're talking about the Roman Empire, in Italy and Sicily, in the 2nd century BC, the 1st century BC, into the 1st century AD, but not in the rest of the empire. And in fact, even in Italy and Sicily, they're probably not the source of most surplus before that time and after that time. Now, to build the notion that we can explain what is going on in the ancient world fundamentally in terms of the slave mode of production, when you've got that empirical base, seems to me very, very dodgy indeed. And anyway, I don't see how it explains anything. And I have the same problem with the idea that serfdom is fundamental to feudalism. I think, this idea that history is actually moving on two different tracks, I think is fundamental to understanding it. Serfdom is not progressive. Slavery is not progressive, ever. That's my position. I don't think it's ever progressive, because you get more productivity and more innovation and more development of technique, the freer the producing population is. That's actually the reality. So to say that you, in some sense, you have a slave mode of production at a certain moment in time is progressive, and a serf mode of production at some point in time is progressive, I think is simply false. And what actually happens in feudalism, I think, is that you've got a much faster rate of development, precisely because feudalism carries with it into its own future the accumulated technique and skill and knowledge of the ancient world. So we're already producing at a much higher level. The last thing I would say is this: the process of change that takes place in the medieval world. I'm going to take the example of England, because England is well ahead of most of late medieval and early modern Europe in terms of the development of capitalism, obviously. I think it's clear from the latest historical and archaeological research that the real impetus in the development of a modern kind of commercial agriculture, which underlies the development of capitalism, which is the initial part of the process of developing capitalism, I think it's clear that the drive is coming not from the aristocracy, not from the upper gentry, who actually are far too busy aping the aristocracy to be interested in developing their estate. It's actually coming from the next level down. It's coming from the middling sort, it's coming from the better off peasants, and to the degree that peasants are successful through class struggles like 1381, to the degree that they are successful in gaining a larger proportion of the surplus, to that degree we see the development of innovation and technique and enclosures and crop rotation and the things that actually begin to create a commercial agriculture. I actually think that the distinction between serfdom and slavery is really very secondary. There you go.